Welcome back to the K12 kitchen. Why do we call this show this? Because we're doing our biology labs here in my kitchen. Today we're on to Unit 2's lab, Investigating Biological Compounds. For this lab, you'll need to supply a couple of your own food items. I have some bread here and some shredded cheese. I shredded this cheese myself though, however, because if you buy shredded cheese already in a bag, it has some starch on it and it can mess up your results. And then you'll also have to supply distilled water. This is a gallon that I bought at Walmart for like 99 cents. Don't use tap water for this lab. You'll need distilled. So let's get started. I already printed out my lab directions, student guide, procedures. You guys can print this out or look at it directly on your laptop. And I have all of my safety equipment because we will be working with chemicals in this lab. So gloves, my K12 apron, and of course, eye protection. So, for this lab, other than the food and water items, you'll also need your test tubes and test tube rack that I've already set up. You'll need to label these test tubes with some masking tape. I didn't have masking tape, so I just used clear tape. Just don't write directly on the glass because one, it's permanent and you might not be able to get it off, or two, if you're not using a permanent marker, it might smear off while you're doing the lab, and then you won't know what test tube that is. So label your test tubes. You'll also need your little graduated cylinder. I like to use a funnel for it as well. We'll be pouring water into that. Some droppers that are labeled, stir rods, and all of your solutions, albumin, unknown, and for phase 1, iodine. We'll get to the solutions for phase 2 and 3 in a minute. So, after your test tubes are labeled, you'll fill up your water test tube no more than halfway with some distilled water. All right. Then to the albumin and unknown test tube, I'm going to add 5 drops of albumin to the albumin test tube. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 5 drops of the unknown solution to the unknown test tube. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've already added some saliva into my spit test tube, my saliva test tube, so don't be afraid. Go ahead and spit into a cup, do it. And then my last 2 test tubes, I'm just going to add some bread, some of my starchy food choice. If you don't have bread, you can use flour or cornstarch, and some cheese or fatty foods to my last test tube. If you don't have cheese, you can use oil or butter. That's totally fine. All right. Next step, I'm going to take my graduated cylinder and pour about 4 milliliters of water into my graduated cylinder. This is why I have the funnel. All right, let's see. I definitely went over. So I'm just going to dump into the sink what I don't need. Let's see if I have 4 milliliters. Looks good. I'm going to take 4 milliliters of my water, and to that I'm going to add 18 drops of iodine. Iodine's in this dark bottle. It needs to stay dark, otherwise it'll go bad. So 18 drops of this. 1, 2, 11, a little bit more. There we go. All right, and then using a pipette that I already have labeled water iodine, I'm going to pick up just a few drops and put a few drops into each of these test tubes. Water iodine mixture going in all of them, a little bit more. A few drops, doesn't have to be exact. About 5 or so. All right, awesome. Next, gently stir each of your test tubes and note any color change that you might see. Ooh, look at that color change. You can stir by hand like I'm doing, or you can grab your stir rods. Just make sure you clean them after each solution. Ooh, yummy. All right. Once I do that, I'm going to record my color changes and the observations that I see onto my lab report in the phase 1 column of number 1 data table. Lastly, for phase 1, I'm going to use my test tube brush, clean up everything, and make sure I'm going to dilute all of my test tubes really well with a lot of water. Once you finish that, you're officially done with phase 1, and we're going on to phase 2. Alright, welcome to phase 2. In phase 1 of our investigating biological compounds lab, you guys tested for starch using iodine and water solution. Phase 2, we're going to be testing for proteins using your copper sulfate. So, prep and setup is still exactly the same as it was before. I've got my water, albumin, unknown, saliva, and my food samples of bread and cheese. The only difference this time is you'll put 40 drops of albumin and 40 drops of the unknown solution into those 2 test tubes rather than only 5. So make sure you do that, and let's get started adding our testing solutions. So to each test tube, you're going to add 20 drops of sodium hydroxide. Clear stuff. Go ahead and count out 20 drops for each one. There we go. Now you shouldn't see many color changes yet. That'll come a little bit later. So save your observations for the data table in a minute. And last one, 20 drops. You guys will obviously take your time and do it much slower than me, but I'm a professional. All right. Then, using the albumin test tube first, you're going to slowly add 1 drop of copper sulfate at a time until you see a color change. So 1 drop, stir. Another drop, stir. Keep doing this and count as you go until you see this color change. So let's see. 3. Oh, that was about 7. We're kind of turning into a light blue color change. There it is. So I have 7, maybe one more, 8 drops till I see my blue color change. You should be around there for yours as well. Anywhere between 5 and 10 drops. Then whatever that number is of drops that you just used for albumin, do the same for the rest of your test tubes. So I was at 8 drops. You might be a little less or a little more. That's okay. And last one. Just as in phase 1, stir each content of the test tubes, or use a different stirring rod for each one. And then, on your student lab report that you either have printed out or here behind the video, note your observations. Last one, my cheese, my fatty food is a little bit hard to stir, so I'm going to use a stirring rod. All right, so the middle column on your data table, copper sulfate, write down color changes and observations that you see. Then, just like in phase 1, clean up each test tube with lots of tap water and your test tube brush. Stay tuned for phase 3. And we are back. Our final phase 3. We've already tested for starches in phase 1 and proteins in phase 2. So phase 3 we'll be testing for lipids using your Sudan 3 solution. Setup is exactly the same as phase 1. You'll put your water, albumin, unknown, saliva, and your 2 food choices into the last 2 test tubes. And unlike phase 2, you'll only add 5 drops of albumin and unknown solution to those test tubes. I've already done albumin, so let's go ahead and add 5 to the unknown. 2, 3, 4, 5. And there we go. All right. Once we have everything set up, grab your Sudan 3, and we'll just add 3 drops of this to each test tube. Only 3. So 1, 2, 3 to the water, 2, 3 albumin. And then, of course, stir or use a stirring rod. Make sure you use multiple stirring rods if you choose to use the glass rods. And then, just like in phase 1 and 2, note any color changes that you may see. So, on your lab report, fill out final column in number 1. Now that you've finished your data table, you're going to go on to the rest of the questions in your lab report, questions 1 through 5. You'll answer which macromolecules were present in the unknown solution, which were present in the albumin, which macromolecules were present in your saliva, and your food choices. I used bread and cheese. Number 3, what do you think the role of the water is? And then lastly, for number 4, you'll just make a prediction and choose 3 other foods. Think about what kind of indicators may show up if you were to do this experiment 3 more times with those foods rather than bread and cheese or whatever you used. And then lastly, tell me what is a chemical indicator and what's it used for in number 5. As always, if you guys have any questions, email me, kspurgeon@insightpa.org, and happy labbing!